Great. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Jennifer Lerus-Roulez. I am the manager of cities with the CCT team, which stands for Communities Climate Transitions. So welcome to this Tamarack webinar on sustainable and affordable housing during the climate crisis. I think everybody's trickling in nicely. So we'll just start in a couple of seconds. At Tamarack, we start every webinar by acknowledging that many of us live and work on Indigenous land and territories, and that we are working actively towards truth and reconciliation. We encourage all of you to do the same. And now is actually a good time to use the chat function, test the chat function, and let us know where you are coming from today. So let's dive into the webinar where our experts will unpack the relationship between poverty and housing and explore the intersection with the climate crisis. This webinar actually came to life to build on our article on the intersection of housing, affordability and climate action. So I will share a link in the chat in a second. You will see on the screen today's speakers, Paul Kershaw and Betsy Agar. The conversation will be moderated by Morag Carter, who is originally from the UK. Morag has called Canada home for over 30 years, where she shares her expertise in community economic development and environmental stewardship. And she's the executive director at the Skills Center, a not-for-profit focused on reducing poverty and strengthening the rural and industrial communities and workplaces in Canada, and in BC specifically. So I will pass her the mic. Over to you, Morag.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate that. Today, we are going to explore the relationship between housing affordability and poverty, and how they are amplified by the climate crisis and some of the lesser known consequences that the climate crisis is having on all of us. It's an issue that's very close to my own heart. In this webinar, we are going to be joined by two distinguished speakers who come from very different backgrounds, but both work at the macro and micro impacts of the housing crisis. Paul Agar and Paul Kershaw and Betsy Agar, sorry about that, Paul and Betsy. Paul and Betsy, welcome. So Betsy Agar is the director of the Pembina Institute's buildings program. She designs policies and programs for the retrofit of Canada's residential building stock. And prior to joining Pembina, Betsy was a founding member of the Renewable Cities at Simon Fraser's University Centres for Dialogue, where she collaborated with colleagues from around the world to expose barriers to implementation for communities fully powered by renewable energy. And Dr. Paul Kershaw is an award-winning tenured professor at the University of British Columbia, UBC. He's a public speaker, a regular media contributor, and a founder of Generation Squeeze, a think change tank that promotes well-being of all generations by rejuvenating democracy to protect what is sacred for younger and future generations, a healthy childhood, home, and a healthy planet. One of the things that we're going to, what we are going to try and do today is actually frame the problem around the opportunities, the problems, the opportunities, and the solutions. And I think Betsy is going to focus on the how, and Paul has got a good, strong focus on the why. So we're going to start today's conversation by helping our speakers locate themselves and their experiences in the climate movement before we turn towards eco-anxiety and climate mental health, and then figuring out how we can help build caring communities and turn those anxieties into action. So Betsy and Paul, so let's start with you, Betsy. What has led you to your role today in the housing sector?
Thanks, Morag, and nice to see you all virtually and to be part of this. So thank you for including me. I began as a I was young at once in the 90s, starting engineering and coming out of civil engineering, a bit puzzled by how I rectify my climate and environmental sensibilities with this career that seemed to just be focused on building new and building out. And about the last 2 weeks of one of my fourth year courses, somebody got me interested in building science. And that has captivated me ever since. So I went out and found myself some building science jobs. Again, though, I found most of what we were doing was in new construction, and yet I knew that there was so much potential in our existing infrastructure in our buildings, and what I really wanted to do and see was how we could retrofit them and make them better. Fast track to about 2010, my family relocated to BC, and I had left behind all of my building science engineering and was starting fresh, and found myself, sort of fishing around in policy advocacy and engagement. Did a little, what I call my fun degree at Capilano University, and then started to volunteer actually at the Center for Dialogue at SFU, which began in Carbon Talks. And that was the introduction for me to talking about a clean, green economy. And wedged in there was how buildings were part of that. And it just reignited my passion for how we could take our buildings and make them so that they're contributing to the solutions as opposed to aggravating them. That folded into Renewable Cities, and then eventually ended up with the Pembina Institute, which at the time was really the organization that I could see that was actively thinking about those big picture barriers and issues in greening our buildings so that they're part of the solution, as I mentioned. So my two careers kind of came full circle. And it's really useful for me to have that kind of technical background and experience. And I just, the amount of learning and understanding about where policy and regulatory processes go and how to influence them has just been an incredible experience. So that's how I got here.
It's a great story. Thank you, Betsy. Paul, what about you?
Oh, well, I'm really excited to be able to join the panel with Betsy, given her story. And let me also acknowledge and thank Tamarack for bringing us together. I mentioned in the chat that I'm coming today from the Katzie territory, which is unceded land in Metro Vancouver. And I also self-define as a homeowner who lives in Metro Vancouver, who over the last many years has gained a tremendous amount of wealth in my home as I've been sleeping and watching television and cooking in my kitchen. And I share that part of my personal story because that has definitely, over the last 10, 15 years, that pattern has driven me into the affordability space on housing. I'm someone who's like deeply concerned that affordability has eroded at a population level for younger generations, newcomers of any age coming to our regions, because of this massive growing gap between home prices and local earnings. And one of the telltale stats that we often report from the Gen Squeeze lab is that when my mom started out in Metro Vancouver, by the way, it took about 5 years of full-time work for the typical young Canadian to save a 20% down payment on an average priced home in Metro Vancouver, in the GTA, and BC and Ontario, across the country. It's all about 5 to 6 years. But if you flash forward to today, it now takes 17 years on average for the country, 21 to 22 in BC and Ontario, closer to 27 in the GTA and Metro Vancouver. That is just a massive deterioration in the way that hard work pays off. It's locking more people out of home ownership, driving them into more and more people looking and competing for scarce numbers of rental. That's driving up rent. And then you have, this sort of trickle down effect of even those with decent incomes now competing for housing that we'd hoped would be there for those with more moderate incomes. And that's then driving people with more moderate incomes to search for what is available for those who are most poor. And that's then causing more and more spaces to not be available for those we'd like to welcome off the street, those who are unhoused. And so that has been my work at the School of Population Health that's driven me into this space of affordability and housing in our country, is at the epicenter of it.
Mm-hmm. These are huge issues in every community across the country. Betsy, your work has focused on the technical issues around in housing, particularly you're making houses healthier and safer through retrofitting and the use of renewable energy. Can you tell us more about the current challenges that you face in the field? What have been your most impactful learning to date?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we're, I appreciate the context that Paul's giving. The way that we're thinking about the building sector is it is our third largest source of emissions. And in some cities, that can be as high as about 60%. So it's a hot topic for cities to try to drive down emissions from their buildings. And we're seeing them really move really quickly on things like new construction. But we know that, with new codes and building in carbon metrics into codes, which is coming both in BC and national codes. But about 80% of the buildings that exist today will still be in existence in 2050. So they can't be left behind as we're thinking about, reducing carbon emissions from our buildings. And so to meet those net zero commitments, we need to be upgrading 600,000 existing homes, all types of homes. It's from apartments through, single family, and 750 million square meters of existing commercial space every year, starting immediately till 2040. That's a retrofit rate of about 5 to 6%. We currently retrofit under 1%, and typically it's more for aesthetics. So we've really been, focused on this and trying to reduce the barriers to deep retrofits in Canada, mostly by trying to prevent fossil fuel lock-in, and particularly stopping fossil fuel build out for new construction, because it doesn't make sense to be including natural gas in new buildings. It's pretty hard to fuel switch, and that's the work that we have ahead of us for existing buildings. We want to make sure that those limited resources, even renewable natural gas, for example, is going to be available for the harder to decarbonize sectors like transportation and industry. And we need to be balancing regulations with incentives, and this is where we start to think about affordability. There's that carrot and stick combination, but we need to make sure that nobody's left behind. One, we can't make housing less affordable than it already is, and ideally make it so that it costs less to heat. But two, to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to participate in an economy where their homes are safe and energy efficient and not contributing to climate change, but helping them live better. And at the same time, we want to make sure that those kinds of incentives are stimulating the market growth and innovation that can start to just trigger natural market transformation. And we need a lot of support to do that. So we need to be clever about how we set those incentives. Some of the ways that we've been doing this is we've had what we call the Reframed initiative, which, most significantly, we've been running a lab for 6 multi-unit residential buildings in the social housing sector. And that's brought together 90 professionals, about give or take, in a lab process that has them thinking more about other aspects and benefits to doing retrofits beyond just making them more energy efficient and beyond even just driving down carbon. There's an opportunity to do seismic upgrades and make them ready for extreme weather by recognizing climate risks in a more formal way and planning for them in their design. And by doing these things all at once, we expect to find some synchronicities between the solutions so that we actually end up saving in the long run in terms of the interventions that need to happen to these houses. And then the other, the way that we work, given we're a policy think tank, it's holding BC governments to the commitments that they've made. And we're also starting to work in Alberta. We think there's huge opportunity there to really improve the energy efficiency programming, et cetera. So really, we're trying to get utilities and governments to see this as an opportunity to invest in Canada, which we know that there are benefits, jobs, as well as growth in GDP by putting that money into kind of local job training, as well as innovation and manufacturing.
You've also been collaborating with international colleagues to expose the barriers that communities face to becoming fully powered by renewable energy. Are there any particular takeaways that you're learning from the international community? Any great stories that are out there from what's going on elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I mean, the two kind of sort of softer ideas that come to mind for me is the elegance of simplicity. You know, some of what we recognized in the Reframe lab that I mentioned was that basic seismic upgrades can be just a matter of how you install, say, plywood sheathing, as opposed to having to do really complex technical pieces. And so there's this knowledge mobilization and understanding that you could do what you're doing better. And then I'm also quite moved by the collective action. You know, we've seen, when I was with Renewable Cities, we toured a utility co-op that really was an effort both to decarbonize the kind of electricity that was being brought into the community, but also allowed for what in the States is known as more energy democracy, where there's local ownership over that, and there's not this sort of central entity that owns the utility, makes all the decisions about it. And again, that energy democracy movement in California has really shifted the power away from the big utilities and into the hands of local communities, where they can benefit more from the actual economic development and more control over what's happening in their local neighborhoods. And even down, again, back to this level at Reframed, when we first started it, one of our biggest worries was that the participating teams, design teams, would be proprietary. And there's just this incredible, not only willingness, but desire for collaborative design. They want to share ideas. It was like watching the engineers go back to school and play with each other and be able to kind of compare their problems and their solutions and come up with them together. They know there's tons of work out there. Mm-hmm. So at that macro level, it's quite moving to see that what's really going to need, to happen is that collective action, and that there are so many people willing to do that. But I'd say, like, the particular, technological and organizational advancements to really accelerate the pace of retrofits, the real piece that needs to happen is support from government and investment. The challenge for home and building owners is that upgrading buildings really doesn't have the financial payback that we tend to rely on these decisions, rely on for making these decisions. We expect that the energy savings will pay for them. It's not enough. And so we need lots of support there. Yeah, there's sort of higher upfront costs. And again, if we're thinking about low-income households, loans, add a burden to their household costs. Things like subsidies or incentives tend to require you to front the capital costs at the outset, which people don't necessarily have. So we're thinking about, how can we better design those so that it's not excluding communities where they're constricted by their cash flow. And then, of course, we also need to be pushing on advancing codes and regulations so that we're not doing this again to the buildings that are being built now, in 20 years, when we need to be actually meeting net zero.
Thank you. Those are really good points, and a clear connection, Paul, to the work that you're doing in BC communities with social housing. And it's also linked to work around homelessness and unequal wealth distribution in Vancouver and BC. Can you unpack some of the links around the climate crisis with and potential and existing future solutions?
Yeah, so on the one hand, Betsy has really ably taken us into thinking at sort of really practical level about building design and building code and public investment to facilitate the energy upgrades and the new builds to be as energy efficient as possible. And that's where so much of the conversation needs to be. But I think, Morag, you'll hear me try to sort of slow us down a little bit and welcome us to take a step back, because right now I'm really focused on the Alberta election and analyzing platforms there. And a couple of things really stand out for me. I mean, on the most dramatically, and I guess in a kind of way that invokes fear for me, is that as the province is suffering a degree of wildfire that is ravaging communities right now at historic levels earlier in the season. People in British Columbia, where I'm from, can definitely relate to that with our fires routinely now and flooding. But during the election, it has been remarkable to see that neither of the major parties that are likely to form a government are intentionally drawing the link between what we're witnessing with extreme weather and a climate crisis. And similarly, when you start to look at their platforms around housing, well, it's really interesting to see, for instance, that the United Conservative Party, the current government, they list 27 themes that are priorities for them on their platform website. Housing isn't one of them. And even when you look at the NDP side, when you're looking at they're going to invest in additional social housing, really important, but they're not seeing that as an opportunity to highlight that they're going to invest in ensuring all new builds are as energy efficient as possible. And so I wanted to have us take a step back and say, we don't just need to know that there are solutions, we still need a little bit of convincing about why we ought to go and embrace them. And when I think about the connections between climate change and housing and affordability, or extreme weather and housing and affordability, I'd say these are symptoms of the same underlying disease. They're both really extraction problems, like extracting good stuff right now and leaving less left over. So, it's common for us to describe climate change as sort of the reflection of we've extracted so much of the atmosphere's scarce capacity to absorb carbon that we leave little bit left over, and extreme weather as our harmful legacy. But you can say the exact same thing about housing and affordability. It's reflecting that, especially in cities across the country, we've extracted so much wealth from our housing systems. You're looking at a poster boy for getting a lot of wealth from the housing system, that we're leaving little affordability left over for those who follow in our footsteps. And that is a common intergenerational tension at the heart of both of these issues. And I think it's really important to see that underlying disease that gives rise to both of these symptoms. Because if we understand that, we can then try and say, we can address that intergenerational tension and start to then solve some of the bigger symptoms that we're fighting with all of the time. So that's one way in which I'd want to bring us back and have people see the connection between these two themes. And then we're at this vexing moment where, because of inflation, which is appropriately grabbing so much of our public attention, that's exacerbating affordability issues across the board, you'll often have political parties start to pit fighting climate change against affordability. And so you'll see, the provincial government in Ontario said, I'm going, had a winning electoral start, I'm going to cut gas taxes in order to make it cheaper for people to manage today's cost of living. But that is then, setting us back on fighting, the pricing of pollution. That definitely is being put on offer again during an election in Alberta right now. And so I think one of the key major messaging issues we need to get out there is we can't solve our wallet problems by neglecting our climate problems. And I would add on top of that, we don't have to use our climate policy to, that is likely to be a place. We need to spend more as individuals and governments, but we can address our wallet problems in so many other ways. So that's why Jen Squeeze is it's important to price pollution. And it's important to say, we're going to make investments in new builds and retrofits that might increase the sticker price at the moment, but it'll be a cheaper operating cost for that building over its lives. And as we're having to face those new costs to fend off an existential risk of climate change, we can invest in other parts of the housing system to achieve deeper affordability. We can reduce other major costs in families' lives, like childcare. So $10 a day childcare is a brand for a national childcare recommendation that started in the Jen Squeeze lab and led to Coalition of Childcare Advocates in BC making a movement with our early childhood educators, and now it's been embraced from coast to coast. But that reduces for people, hockey moms and soccer moms that many political parties are saying, we want to make it possible for you to get your kids from here and there. it's a much bigger savings in people's wallets when childcare is no longer another rent or mortgage size payment. That addresses affordability concerns. We can have a good poverty reduction strategy to address affordability concerns. Don't require everything about fighting climate change to also always be good for our wallet. There's a lot of other policy envelopes we can do that affordability work while still needing to incur the costs required to fight climate change. I'll pause there for a minute.
Thank you, Paul. I just want to pick up on the childcare piece a little bit. You know, I mean, it's because you're right. It was a mortgage-sized payment that families were doing, especially families with more than one child in the daycare system. So I just want to probe your work a little bit around childcare. And to get you to talk a little bit about the first ever tax on empty homes in North America. How did you achieve that milestone? And have you noticed impacts on intergenerational relationships, amongst other things, since?
Yes, so I think on the, I partly trained in political science when doing my doctoral work. And one of the key things that it took me longer to realize, but evidence is but one factor that really shapes public policy. Evidence is but one factor that shapes human beings' behaviors and decisions. We are deeply, deeply shaped by our broader cultural context and existing patterns. The status quo has huge influences over us. And so when you want to change public policy, it's partly about knowing the technical solutions. And we better go back to Betsy because she has really good observations about those technical solutions. But before we can even get political will to create those or act on those technical solutions, we need to have sort of created political cover for politicians to courageously act on the evidence. And I think that's the kind of the work that Generation Squeeze as a think and change tank tries to specialize in. We know technical solutions, but we're going to work further up the process of shaping people's opinion, framing their beliefs about problems and solutions. And so the $10 a day childcare is an example that can give us hope for further climate change mitigation wins. Because I remember, when we started $10 a day childcare as a framing strategy around 2010, I would go and do local radio stations and have many, many people get angry with me in the call-in talk shows. And, well, we didn't have childcare back in the day. Why do you need it now? If you can't afford them, don't have kids. That would be a typical refrain. But if you flash forward to today, I can go and talk about $10 a day childcare and I'm like, yeah, we really need it. And so there's a moment of ongoing framing still required. And that's why I think that in order to support the important technical work that Betsy and her team and others can offer for what do net zero buildings look like, both as new builds and trying to reduce energy use in existing builds, we have to offer the broader frame. We can't solve our wallet problems by neglecting our climate crisis. And that work still needs to happen in a place like Alberta that is literally and figuratively on fire right now. That province is showcasing for us. We still have work to do to help people figure out the ways to have a win-win, better cost of living and fighting climate change, whereas too often they're pitted against one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's
I didn't talk on the first empty homes. I could give you another example of what that looks like, but I think let's head back to Betsy.
No, absolutely. I mean, yes, totally. Betsy, well, this is actually a question for both of you. In both of your experiences, how can we increase cross-sectoral collaboration towards a more affordable and a just housing market in Canada? Who wants to take that first? Betsy?
I mean, yeah, I have some high-level thoughts, and I appreciate what you're pointing out, Paul. I think the framing is, we'll see similar patterns in lots of the work that Pembina has been doing over the years. There are windows of opportunity, and it's a long haul shaping policy and public opinion. Mm-hmm. But I think I've already alluded to it a little bit, is that we definitely need regulations to lay the hammer down on how we're building houses. Regulations are trickier when for existing buildings. It's once a building's built, there aren't a lot of opportunities to intervene in how they operate or any changes that are made. So there are some pieces like mandating equipment that will essentially phase out furnaces and boilers. And that's where we have to be sensitive to that, that concern about low-income households, for example. Right now, heat pumps cost easily, twice what furnaces typically cost. And this is why we're seeing really aggressive incentive programs. Incentive programs that can both drive that market, that heat pump market, so that it starts to carry on without supports, as well as making sure that everybody can participate in it would be the ideal. The concern is that anybody who is already inclined to put in a heat pump and can afford to do that, is tapping into these incentives where we could be driving them, more specifically to households that can't afford that. And then I've already mentioned that finding synergies between solution outcomes. There are lots of ways, when I think specifically about low-rise buildings that typically were built kind of in the 60s, these are often the most affordable homes. They're actually also often the ones that need the most work. They're ready for a lot of upgrades. The way that we typically approach them is, something fails, you have a contractor in to fix it. We need to get better about finding the synergies across the different aspects of housing systems or home systems, so that we're not increasing the costs of these interventions, or finding synergies between them. And the other thing that, as I mentioned, what we tried to do with the Reframed Lab and has been shaping our thinking is to really take these once-in-a-lifetime opportunities and think about what are the additional benefits that we could be building in. So, we all know that over 600 people died in supposedly safe at home last year in the heat dome. Housing is where we're supposed to feel safe and make sure that it's healthy. We have fresh air. We have, we don't have moisture buildup. There are lots more things going on in our buildings than just wasteful energy or carbon emissions. And these typically, often impact lower resourced communities, people who are more vulnerable, elderly, young children without a lot of resources, people living with chronic diseases. These need to be considered when we're thinking about how do we ready these buildings for this net zero future. And so those are really kind of the opportunities that we're thinking about in our longer term planning. Heat pumps have that added bonus of being able to provide cooling. And so it's built in. What sometimes missed is that we also need to have ventilation and filtering. When we have fire events, for example, the ventilation needs to be able to control the pollution. We've also seen, we've learned a lot about air changes and how much fresh air we need inside of a building. And because of COVID, and we actually have a moment where the public understands things about buildings that I never thought anybody would understand, in terms of how we live in them, how our buildings affect us, and what the opportunities are to improve them. So, to Paul's point there, when you're starting to think about public well-being, we can touch on the other aspects that maybe don't seem like a building science engineer's problems, unless you actually start to wrap them into your designing and your planning. So it's more that integrated thinking that we've been trying to influence.
Paul, do you want to take a crack at that?
I'd like to. So I think the intersectoral collaboration is important at so many levels, and the challenge to doing it is, making it a priority. Each of our organizations and institutions can have momentum of its own. We're so busy, it's hard to then make time to go and think about the opportunities for strategically collaborating with others. So that's not a new insight for anyone. People are like, yeah, no duh. But let me give you a few examples of where this would be important. So at the highest level of institutions, nationally, Canada has the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, largely responsible for implementing our national housing strategy. We have the Canada Infrastructure Bank, largely responsible for feeding and incentivizing the greening of our economy. The Canada Infrastructure Bank has been, to some degree, critiqued for not getting enough investment out quickly enough. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has been critiqued like not having enough money to spend. The CMHC doesn't have a mandate as it's getting new housing built at affordable levels to make it them green. And to some degree, actually, that lack of mandate is giving rise to people and organizations and companies taking advantage of CMHC funding. But then they might be interested in greening the buildings, but that doesn't quite fit with what the application to which they're applying. This is a huge missed opportunity. If we are going to be building new homes right now at levels that we haven't seen because we need more supply to help address our housing unaffordability crisis, we have desperately got to make sure that we are greening them simultaneously. So intersectoral collaboration, let's fuse the mandates of the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation more so that there's a win-win for both of those institutions. At the kind of movement level, I take an organization like the Atmospheric Fund in the GTHA. I guess they're Hamilton-based, if I'm recording. Apologies to anyone. Toronto-based.
Yeah.
Apologies to those the not getting quite the location right. But I love how that's a group that's very interested in the heat pump theme and the retrofitting existing builds themes for greening purposes. But they're taking that now to the Federation for Canadian Municipalities and locking that into broader conversations about housing affordability. Like, good on the Atmospheric Fund for sort of more climate movement, typically going and making those collaborations with cities on housing affordability. And then I think maybe Betsy could help me out a little bit here more, but the regulatory level. This is a moment where we have a lot of regulations in place, appropriately so, for to protect people and their homes. But some of the codes and building codes, they don't capture the urgency of the moment, I would say. And I'm going a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but let me give you some concrete examples. My home, I have a 100 amp service on my grid. And to add the heat pump that I would really like to do, I could either go and upgrade my service, which is complicated for a whole range of reasons I won't bore people, not to mention costly, or I would love to be able to say, there's ways that I can kind of use more sophisticated fuses and switch some things off when I'm relying on my heat pump. But that's not an option to me in the way it is when I plug in my EV car. And so I'm like, oh, come on, there should be something with the code that gives us a little more flexibility in the moment. Or even reusing gray water. We're increasingly in communities that are struggling with water levels as our populations are increasing and our temperatures are rising. So, they're easy things. I see my in-laws when they come in their RV and they have this cool little lever that, directs water from one pipe into another in their RV. And I'm like, I'd like that in my home to direct my bathroom sink and shower water into, gray water that I can use for watering around my home. But public health would actually have some concerns about that. And I think this is these moments where we need our disciplinary regulations, which have good reasons to be protecting health and protecting my circuit board, but to be thinking about how the regulations fit in this broader crisis right now to reduce our emissions and be more efficient and have less waste. And so I think I would love to be able to sit in some conversations with people who are actual experts on that more so than me and hear what their opportunities are, what the opportunities they see to move in positive directions that way.
Excellent, Paul. So just one last question. Any major success stories that you would like to highlight before we go into the Q&A from our audience today?
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll pick up on a theme that Morag asked earlier about. We often talk about unaffordability as if rising home prices are uniformly bad. It's really important to recognize that rising home prices have been sustained for years and years and years in this country, in no small part because for many people, homeowners like myself, especially homeowners who've been in the market for some time, are benefiting. It makes us richer. And so I do think there are some success stories. You drew attention, Morag, earlier to the first ever tax on empty homes, and it started in Vancouver. That's a theme that's kind of spreading in other places. And so there have been some developments where we are increasingly open to tapping into the wealth that is being generated by rising home prices, which gives some benefits and causes some societal harms. And I think that matters because as we need the investment for both more deeply affordable homes and more energy efficient buildings, we have to think about where are we going to find the resources to do that. And so I think that the conversation about tapping into the housing wealth that has been created in this country by rising home prices is an opportunity that we haven't utilized as much. And so I think that we got some early moments of taxation starting to shift in that direction. Even in BC, we do, we're likely now going to have this, kind of flipping tax. So these are minor ways where we're sort of scraping around the edges of like, oh, there has been some wealth produced. High home prices haven't been uniformly bad for everyone. So those who are benefiting, how might we ask you to lean in and contribute a little bit more to public resources so that we can address these big crises with affordability and climate? So I see that as something that gives me hope. Is it a major win yet? No, but there have been enough incremental wins that I can see this being a bigger part of the solution going forward.
Thanks, Paul. There's a question from Tamara Marcus. How do you work to empower individuals who have traditionally not been represented into positions of power within your organizations? And then what does capacity building look like for your organization, whether it's internally into your organization or in the community in which you work? So Paul, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah, think about this a great deal. Tamara, great question. You're looking at a white boy who's the picture of unearned privilege. Male, white, middle-class background, now has a more affluent income of that, with security as a professor, of Christian background. They make seatbelts and airbags for my height and weight. So that's a lot of unearned privilege. And as the director, say, of our Masters of Public Health program at UBC, I'm constantly thinking about how I can use some of that unearned privilege to disrupt the power dynamics in my profession and in society. At UBC, in my program, we have opportunities to specifically recruit student leaders who are people of color, Indigenous students, to make sure that we are empowering students to be part of our leadership team and capture a greater amount of the diversity that reflects our communities, more so than the faculty, which still tends to be white and male. Within Gen Squeeze, it's a more interesting question. There, I'm thinking, how do we keep the lights on? How do we raise enough money to even have staff? So to be honest, that is the bigger, more overarching concern. And then though, our recruitment strategies are really focused on the kinds of issues that you are identifying. And so those would be two examples.
Betsy, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So internally, one of the sort of stimulants for really taking action on that is we signed on to the Equal by 30 campaign, which is a campaign that is supported at the federal government level. And we quickly realized that, not surprisingly, we're a charity, and we actually already come pretty close to having equal gender representation. That certainly didn't mean that we were done. And so we started to mobilize around priorities that resoundingly our staff really raised, and at its top was reconciliation. So we're developing a reconciliation policy and strategy. We're revising all of our policies to better reflect the principles around UNDRIP, or UNDRIPA. And so, while the gender piece is pretty close to done, it doesn't mean that we don't have more work to do in terms of breaking down other barriers. One of the opportunities, I think, in terms of carrying our successes forward is when we do engagement outside of our own events, we can ask those questions like, what does the panel look like that I'm on? And have you included these types of questions when you're sourcing speakers, for example? So trying to kind of go along what you might call our value chain and influence outside of what we already do. And then, key to that is also changing how and where we recruit for people. And then there are also opportunities to partner with groups that offer internships to potentially new Canadians or more diverse selection of students, say, coming out of school. And we've had the privilege of working with a few different groups in that way too.
Thank you. There's a great question here from Panesh Jani, who asks what role local governments can play in supporting affordable housing. What sort of flexibility shall be incorporated into regulatory policies such as zoning, bylaws, and official community plans?
Yeah, it's an interesting and very, it's not a question that kind of fits across the board. It depends on the relationship that any given municipality has with its province in terms of its freedoms of, what kinds of bylaws that they can implement. I think we're seeing a lot of tools that municipalities are using that require certain portions of buildings to be low income rentals. There are covenants that people are, or that municipalities are requiring on new construction that require a certain portion to be more affordable housing, for example. In terms of I'm going to go back to more the sort of structural aspects. I think communities are questioning the types of buildings that they're, allowing to be built. So, to Paul's point about the wealth that's held in, say, single family home ownership, some of that needs to be sort of converted into more multi-unit residential buildings. And so municipalities are looking at ways to do that, what they call, gentle densification. And I think that also helps in creating more variety in terms of the types of housing and the, as well as the scale and the cost of housing for people trying to live in the neighborhoods, that otherwise are they're excluded from.
Thank you, Betsy. There's a great question here from Marisha Iverson, who says that she works in Cochrane, Alberta, one of the fastest growing areas in Canada. A huge number of new homes are being built. What do you think are the best avenues for advocating for these homes to be built green? Provincial government, municipal government, building associations, all of those areas. Paul, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, what a great question. Cochrane's also the home to my lovely in-laws, so I have a really deep connection to Cochrane. I would encourage, especially at this moment, because the provincial election is so top of mind, that the provincial government is a really key place for your advocacy. As mentioned before, one of the two parties running for office right now, the current incumbent government, doesn't even identify housing in its top 27 themes as priorities. And so that surprises me at this moment in Canada. I would not have expected to see that of a party that's in power right now and vying to be reelected. But even the main competitor party is not making the connections between building the social housing. And I see Jill's asking about success stories about housing, climate adaptation, lower income neighborhoods. That is going to be thinking about building more social housing, more below market housing, but making sure we're doing it in very energy net efficient ways. If new builds, as much as possible, is net zero. And so that connection hasn't been drawn yet by the provincial NDP. So I would say focus there. There's clearly important work to be done at the provincial level. And the earlier question, I think, was Pranesh, who was saying, what do we do municipally? I think Betsy has really nailed a lot of the things there. And also recognize that the municipal level can only do so much. Their zoning is critical, such a powerful lever. Their approvals process is critical, but municipalities collect 7, 8, 9 cents on the Canadian tax dollar. They don't have a ton of resources financially. So municipalities need to use their voices to call for their senior levels of government to invest cleverly in deep affordability and simultaneously in greening our buildings so that we reduce their contributions to our overall emissions and climate change.
There's actually a related question here from Lacey Williams, who is asking about whether or not there is an ethical obligation to be held by real estate agencies. And I know that this is actually one of the really big issues around greening homes is then how do you then resell your home? How do real estate agents sell homes? So what do you think? Is there an ethical responsibility there in the realty industry?
I mean, I can't really speak to real estate ethics. I don't know what they're really held to. You know, it's definitely an avenue that we've seen a lot of work on. If you know, I can liken it to when the walkability score got really popular. So speaking of, you know, a long-term work on framing what should be valued by people. And, you know, there was this tradition of at a certain scale map, you could put a toonie down and that could tell you, okay, this is what makes a neighborhood walkable around your house, is what amenities you could walk to, and you're rated on that. And it took a long time for anybody to really want to really embrace that walkability score. And now it's quite common to be able to find it. And I think that, you know, I think you're onto something in the sense that the real estate market needs to see you know, sharing out energy efficiency or carbon, we'll say efficiency, as a benefit, particularly as we see regulations coming that are going to be restricting, you know, the kind of emissions that these buildings can put out, you know, as a benefit to customers, as opposed to, you know, a risk in trying to sell homes. There is definitely some work there to get them on board.
Thank you. There's another question here from that says, how can the argument be made to incorporate sustainability building practices into non-profit housing builds, specifically when the non-profit or the charity that is building them is concerned about using donor funds judiciously?
Oh, you know, this should be the easiest place to make the case.
Yeah, totally.
So if we can't make it here, then I'm leaving despairing a little bit. So no, I'm not going to despair. I'm bringing up my optimism. The case. So I think you start with the line that we can't solve our wallet problems by neglecting our climate problems. And actually, if you're building new buildings in a nonprofit way, then you kind of have the patience, whether it's patient philanthropy or patient public investment, to recognize there's money to be saved by building energy efficiently, both in the terms of your energy costs are lower, and at a societal level, we're doing what we can to reduce the costs that we are going to incur as extreme weather gets worse and worse as the climate changes. And so I would draw people's attention to CCI, Canadian Climate Institute, CCI's recent study called damage control. And I would help bring that into the conversation with your charitable organization trying to fund this nonprofit housing and see, you know, actually the math totally adds up, especially if we are that kind of patient philanthropy and the patient public investment, because, you know, sometimes the building cost at that moment might look a little bit higher, but, you know, in just a matter of years, we're talking about having really reaped the savings. So the case there should speak for itself. The bigger challenges in the rest of the market, where you have people wrestling to figure out how to come up with their big down payments, or they're just struggling to, you know, pay for rents, and they're, you know, the passing on of the costs of doing the retrofits in that moment of sale or that moment of increased rent can be a real moment of challenge for the people paying that. And so we have to, as a society, we have to figure out how do we smooth that out. That, in my view, is the bigger public policy challenge, not at the not-for-profit level where we're already making the public investment or the charities are well-intentioned.
If I could jump in there, you know, to your question, this exercise of thinking about, okay, with the longer term cost benefits, we don't have to guess at this. There's sort of there are very structured mechanisms that look at the total cost of building ownership. And if, you know, as they evolve, they're starting to think about how is insurance going to change if I'm not building a home that's ready for any sort of you know, low carbon requirements or regulations, that's ready for coming climate changes and extreme weather. You know, that'll impact insurance costs. A well-built home should also, you know, require smaller equipment, and which also should require, you know, less maintenance, less wear and tear. You know, there are longer term benefits. And so, you know, there's a company called CEFAR, SEEFAR, that actually provides total cost of building ownership modeling, where you can kind of go, this is what we're thinking about doing, and it can give you advice on like how you can improve those pieces. You know, and the concerns that we've heard in working with social housing groups is they have a bigger problem just getting their households to put the heat on, because the cost of heating just is outside of the household capacity to pay for it, and that like has longer term impacts. Now you have buildup of moisture, and you can potentially have mold. And so now you've got, it's not just that these people are cold in their houses, you're actually damaging your building if people are choosing not to heat them. And so they're bigger picture pieces that I think, you know, to Paul's point, that are being missed in this long-term planning. And social housing operators and owners are thinking in way longer trajectories, and so this is an easy win, you know.
Absolutely. So one last very quick question before I hand this back to Tamarack. So a lovely question from Jill, who always has really great campaigning questions. So how best can residents, community members, be engaged and centered in climate and housing affordability action?
I mean, one of the pieces that we're encouraging is really involving the residents in understanding what the building needs. You know, not just sending an engineering crew or architect to walk around and kind of go, here are the upgrades that we need. What is their lived experience within that? And then, you know, BC housing has started to require tenant liaison during a construction project, who can really work with, you know, particularly if there are people or tenants who have higher needs or particular needs, you know, to kind of ease that process of construction. That's another benefit. And really getting in touch with, you know, what is working, and the only way to do that is kind of doing an outgoing you know, tenant engagement process that looks at, okay, you know, are your needs being met, what needs to be tweaked, and taking all those pieces of data and you know, carrying them forward into future projects, for example. I'm sure Paul has a comment on that too.
I'm conscious of the time though, at 10:58. Did you want to hand it back to Jennifer?
Oh, I think you can. I think you've got like 30 seconds, and then we'll hand it back to Jennifer.
Well, I think politics responds to those who organize and show up. So I'm with Jill. You know, how do we engage people? I would encourage, don't forget going up to the higher framing still. There's some work to do to help people see the examples of extreme weather and what the causes of that. You know, we're emitting this, you know, this carbon pollution that's creating this blanket overhead that's causing us to warm, causing extreme weather, and then draw that attention to the evidence about what buildings are contributing to that. And if we help create the mess, we need to help clean it up. And I think that's the kind of way in which you can center people's engagement on climate and housing. And so much more to say on that, but I think I ran out of 30 seconds.
And Laura has also posted a link to a Hill Times op-ed today that got published today, that she co-wrote with people from the David Suzuki Foundation. Paul and Betsy, thank you so much for the really great conversation today. And with that, I'm going to hand this back to Jennifer, who's going to take us out at the top of the hour.
Thank you, Morag.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, all three of you, for this fantastic conversation, and thank you so much for being so conscious of the time. I think questions were going to keep coming, but I think there was a lot of interest in this topic, so it's a good sign for us to continue talking about it and working on it, and inviting great speakers such as yourself. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for our speakers and moderator for taking the time to engage in this conversation. A few housekeeping notes before we let you go. We have the recording that will be emailed to all of the registrants in a couple of days, as well as all of the fantastic resources that were mentioned during this session. Before you sign off, if you can complete the event survey that will appear on your screen, that would be very helpful, because we want to know what you think of this session today. Finally, don't miss the next CCT webinar. So we will have a part 2 on the topic of the links between poverty, housing, and climate that will take place during the fall. So if you want to sign up to our newsletters. You'll be the first ones to hear about it. And then on July 26th, we also have Seth Klein from Climate Emergency Unit, who will speak on grassroots versus grass tops and the complex dynamics of achieving a just transition. So thank you so much for attending and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.